Welcome. This is the third event in the post-liberalism series for Res Publica. Two previous events discussed the future of post-liberalism internationally and in the UK. You can find both recordings on Res Publica's YouTube channel and on the Res Publica website. The series events will continue next year with topics ranging from education, the church and more. A little bit of housekeeping before we get going. The final hour of the webinar is going to be devoted to audience questions. So if you would like to ask a question at any point to any of our speakers, please use the Q&A function rather than the chat or the raise a hand function, and those questions will be fed through to me. If your question is chosen, you will be added to the chat, including video. So don't be surprised. If you'd like to turn off your video, that's absolutely fine, and just give your question through audio. But yes, do be aware that you might be suddenly pulled up on video if we have your question selected. Okay, so today we're discussing the feminist movement, a movement that has always been famous for its internal divisions. During the second wave of the 70s and 80s, Anglophone feminism was divided roughly into three parts: socialist, radical and liberal. And in the decades since, liberal feminism has proved triumphant and now dominates, particularly in the media and in academia. This is a strand of feminism that prioritises freedom above all else, and this emphasis on freedom lends itself inevitably to a certain discomfort with the female body, because our bodies enable our existence, but they also limit us. Women bear and nurse children, women are also smaller and weaker than men on average, and this is even before we get on to the hotly contested question of whether or not there are average psychological differences between the sexes, a question that has historically provoked fierce debate among feminists. These differences between men and women are painful if what you long for is absolute freedom. And so what we've seen happen within liberal feminism in recent decades is a move away from the material reality of the body, indicated most clearly by the embrace of the modern transgender movement, which denies altogether the existence of meaningful differences between the sexes. The key opposition to this movement has come mostly from a group of women influenced by the radical feminism of the second wave. And this group has had a lot of success in challenging the status quo. But this is a radical feminism that's changed somewhat in the last 40 years. For one thing, a lot of feminist discussion and activism now happens online. For another, the political landscape has changed significantly and feminism is now faced with new challenges, for instance, the huge expansion of the online porn industry. In other words, feminism is at a crossroads, and those of us who are sceptical of the liberal account of freedom are tasked with thinking seriously about where feminism is headed next. So towards that effort, we're joined today by some of the most interesting feminist thinkers working in the UK. Nina Power is going to be speaking about the marginalisation of historical materialism within feminism. Nimco Ali is going to be talking about the role of African feminists working on the front line in the fight against FGM. Kathleen Stock is going to be speaking about the position of feminism within academia. And our first speaker, Mary Harrington, who is a writer and columnist at Unheard magazine, is speaking about the motherhood-shaped blind spot in feminism. I can pass over to Mary.
Thanks, Louise. Before I had a baby, I thought all the usual liberal things about men and women were true. That is, we're all basically the same, apart from our dangly bits. We all aspire to freedom. We all want to choose our relationships and our values rather than have them imposed on us. A successful career is something everyone aspires to. Unequal career outcomes are the result only of sexism. Women can do anything men can. We just need the freedom to try. Then I got pregnant. And I found I was no longer a free individual as I was before. Instead, I was something my liberalism didn't really have a language for, which is a person in a symbiotic relationship. But my symbiote wasn't some kind of creepy parasite. She was a longed-for baby. She was loved, she was wanted, as well as being dependent. And her well-being was more important to me than pretty much anything else, including my own life. Then I found out that that feeling of symbiosis doesn't stop when I gave birth and I was suddenly physically separate from my baby. I would routinely wake in the night a few seconds before she started crying for a feed. I'd lose the ability to think clearly when she needed food. Literally the only time in 20 years of driving I've ever damaged a car was trying to get it round a tight corner with a hungry baby screaming in the back. All these things get less overwhelming as the baby gets older, but talking to other mums, my sense is that that feeling of being not totally separate from your kids never really goes away. I'm 41 now. My mum still often phones moments after I've thought of her. I call this the mum Bluetooth, and we have no language for talking about it. And this is a blind spot that has political repercussions for women, particularly. Babies are weirdly missing from mainstream liberal feminism, except as a problem to be solved. Either they're an unwanted pregnancy, or they're holding our earning potential back, or they're causing unpaid labour, also known as caring work, which isn't shared equally by men. The unstated premise behind all of this is that individual freedom is the highest aspiration for all humans, and inasmuch as female biology pushes against individual freedom, women's biology needs to be overcome. The Economist, for example, writing about the loss of earnings that accompanies taking a career break to care for children, calls this loss of earnings the motherhood penalty. That is, for a feminism that's premised only on freedom and individualism, self-actualization, motherhood is not a superpower, it's a punishment. This grudging relationship of femaleness to the ideal liberal subject goes all the way back to the first liberal thinkers. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who's one of the foundational thinkers of modern liberalism, didn't even believe women could be free in this way, and envisaged an education for men that trained them to be independent liberal subjects, while women should be raised as charming, compliant support humans. It wasn't long before Mary Wollstonecraft challenged the idea that liberalism was just a boys' club. She claimed education, freedom, and emancipation for women on equal terms with men, kick-starting back in the 18th century the movement that eventually became feminism. But here, I'm going to be provocative and suggest that actually, in a way, Rousseau was right. Women are less well-suited to liberal autonomy than men. But this is not an argument against women or against motherhood, it's an argument against liberalism. If we believe that the ideal human condition is autonomy, we have no way of thinking about humans as interdependent. And motherhood is the most concrete example of interdependence. An unborn baby is not a separate individual, but nor is it a parasite, and nor is it merely a thing. Even after a baby's born, it's not really a separate person. The paediatrician Donald Winnicott famously said, "There is no such thing as a baby, only a baby and someone." I wasn't imagining that feeling of being merged that was so strong when my daughter was tiny. It was in fact an accurate understanding of her condition. If I or someone else didn't love and care for her, she would die. In the framework of freedom and individual rights, we have no language for this kind of interdependence. Liberalism and liberal feminism is a doctrine that gives a good account of human society only if you airbrush out all states of dependence. That means that to make the privileging of freedom work, you have to look away from childhood, you have to look away from old age, you have to look away from illness, and you have to look away from disability. And if you base your worldview only on freedom, you'll also end up scribbling out the other side of dependency, which is care. So it should come as no surprise that we have more freedom than ever before, but we also have a care deficit that no one knows how to address. We all clapped for the carers during the lockdown and then went straight back to underpaying them. We wince at every nursing home scandal, but have no idea what to do about them, because ignoring dependency and undervaluing care is baked into the liberal worldview. And women, whose biological superpower is the ability to create new humans through a process of symbiosis followed by years of loving care, can find that superpower treated as though it's in fact a handicap. The sociologist Catherine Hakim has argued that the developed world women's working preferences actually break down roughly as follows. 20% of mothers prefer to spend all their time with kids, 20% prefer to focus mainly on career, and the remaining 60% prefer a balance of the two. That certainly accords with my anecdotal experience from my own life and the lives of my friends. But what this means is that 80% of women prefer to make some space in their lives for priorities associated with caring. And yet, because feminism has the liberal blind spot around dependency and care, we find the preoccupations of this feminism heavily skewed towards the priorities of that 20% of women whose main priority is individual self-actualization. That is, the 20% who want a career on the same terms as men. So we have a feminism of childcare, pay gaps, workplace etiquette, celebrating the achievements of successful women and so on. What about the other 80% though? Are we not also women? Whenever I tell people I don't want to work any harder because I prefer to make some time for family, I sometimes feel vaguely as though I'm letting the side down, but loving your kids should not be a source of shame. To be clear, I am not arguing for sending women back to the kitchen. The Victorian cult of domesticity is long gone and no one's going to thank me for suggesting it would come back, even if I did think that. Which I don't. What I'm saying is that a number of key issues for women can't easily be addressed unless we stop pretending it's possible to worship individual freedom and also advocate for women. If we privilege freedom over biology, we end up writing female bodies out of feminism altogether, as Louise has already pointed out. That means obstetric care, reproductive health care, and family issues are no longer specific to women. We become bleeders, menstruators, uterus havers. It also means that even where sex segregation is in place for women's safety, this becomes difficult to defend. It means, likewise, if we see males and the careerist female 20% as the workplace default, we'll struggle to rethink work in ways that meet the needs and the preferences of the 80% of women who prefer more of a balance. That in turn means a huge proportion of women will end up spending our working lives either having fewer kids than they'd like, which is now the norm all over the West, or else chronically guilty and burned out trying to live up to ideals that were supposedly feminist and were supposed to be there to free us. To repeat, this is not an argument that there's something wrong with women. It's that there's something wrong with worshipping freedom and calling it feminism. The feminisms that reject this privileging only of freedom and seek to recenter the women's movement on female bodies are diverse, and there's plenty to disagree on. This is a space, after all, where conservative Christian thought overlaps with radical feminism, as well as with others such as me who don't fit neatly in either of those groups. My aim here is just to name the blind spot, to create more space for acknowledging the overlapping themes of women's bodies, motherhood as a superpower, and the politics of love and interdependence. Nothing makes it more self-evident than gestating a baby that we belong to each other and not just to ourselves. That's an idea I'd like to see embraced not just by feminists, not even just by women, but by everyone. It's sorely missing from our atomized and adversarial politics. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. I'm going to save questions till the end and go straight to the next speaker, which is Nina Power. Nina is a writer and philosopher. She's the author of many articles on art, culture and ideas, and her forthcoming book, What Do Men Want?, is out in 2021. Nina, over to you.
Right, yeah, thanks Louise, and thanks Mary. I prepared like a short talk, so I'm going to read out what I prepared basically. So today, I think increasing numbers of women are politically dispossessed. This holds across the political spectrum and across all the major parties. Labour's extremely Stasi-like interrogation and expulsion of some of its female members in 2018 on the basis of private social media posts certainly shocked me into not renewing my membership, and I think shocked a lot of other people as well. The Green Party's use of the phrase non-men back in 2016 was also alarming. And as Beatrix Campbell, who resigned from the party, wrote in her resignation letter of July of this year, liberalism became host to tyranny and misogyny when damned feminists and gays and people whose job it is to think debated sex, bodies and gender, cultures and power about prostitution, sex trafficking, child sex abuse. They met a wall of denial and harassment. When they queried cultishness and the injunction, there is no debate, they were maligned as TERFs, trans-exclusionary radical feminists, disciplined and even sued. The Lib Dems are no better with their disciplinary subgroup of the Federal Board this year presenting definitions of so-called transphobia so broad that any discussion by party members of any potential clash of rights or even raising questions about the impacts of proposed legal changes are completely silenced preemptively. Tory Liz Truss's more balanced approach this year, not bowing down to demands for self-ID, but making the process of getting a gender recognition certificate slightly easier and proposing to open 3 more gender clinics, was still met with howls of outrage from trans activists whose tactics of punishing women especially, but not only, over the past 5 years or so have been extreme, threatening violence, actual violence, attempting and in some cases succeeding in losing women employment, targeting and bullying them and so on. So aside from the intricacies of political life, I want to raise a number of questions about what on earth has happened to the legacy of feminism, particularly the second wave, in relation to the left, especially, but not only. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind that the meaning and use of gender as a term, this key example, has shifted quite profoundly within my own lifetime. As a Gen X person who grew up with the idea that gender was an oppressive set of social expectations based on what sex you were, that was increasingly, and I think this was actually the case, in the process of being abolished or diminished, at least. So basically, we were told at school and by the wider culture that just because you were a girl, it shouldn't hold you back. It shouldn't stop you from doing anything that you wanted to do, even if it was non-traditional for girls or women to be interested in whatever thing it was. Also, in this recent conception, the conception that I grew up with, and many others, sex was real and gender was something that was kind of imposed on top of it. Also, we very much understood that life was potentially very hard, unfair, and that adolescence in particular was horrific. for everyone. I think something that's also forgotten today in a very damaging way, so that people internalize a sense that they are somehow to blame individually for the suffering that they feel, particularly going through puberty. All of these kinds of understandings were really a trickle-down success, I would say, of the second wave, such that they kind of filtered into primary schools and secondary schools. That was a kind of victory of the second wave, I would say. And it was also emancipatory for boys, who were similarly encouraged not to feel restricted in the expression of their being and interests and sexuality. So that the second wave feminist arguments were also kind of positive, I would say, for the kind of emancipation of men too. Since a certain point, and I'm not exactly sure when, another definition of gender as a kind of inner individual feeling or an identity has usurped this earlier idea of gender as a kind of social construct. Even to discuss this shift in the meaning of the term seems controversial, as if we were supposed to somehow memory hole the meaning of words and concepts which until recently operated quite differently. And this memory holing really goes to the heart of something I find continually quite mind-bending about the current situation, which is to say the obvious rewriting of history and women's role that necessarily follows the redefinition of gender as an inner feeling, or the idea that sex is somehow now irrelevant for understanding how human societies have operated in the past and today. Now, if you're on the left, if you're a Marxist feminist, a materialist feminist, a socialist feminist, the inability to discuss the shifts in the historical treatment of women over time is, you would have thought, going to pose something of a problem for your entire approach. As Eleanor Burke-Leacock puts it in her famous 1972 introduction to Engels' Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, she writes, "The subjugation of the female sex was based on the transformation of their socially necessary labour into a private service through the separation of the family from the clan. The separation of the family from the clan and the institution of monogamous marriage were the social expressions of developing private property. So-called monogamy afforded the means through which property could be individually inherited." This approach, and indeed that of Marx, Engels, and all of the Marxist and materialist feminists that followed, was until recently, I think, quite well understood. Women historically could not have identified out of being women, and the vicissitudes of their relative social status and political standing before and after the capitalist mode of production was understood to have been to have occurred basically on the basis of a combination of biology and class. I mean, what else is there if you're a historical materialist? And the discussions of reproduction were encompassed biological reproduction, the proprietorial relation to women's bodies and labour, and the question of care and reproduction more broadly. So social reproduction, i.e. how the species kind of keeps going on a daily basis, how it reproduces itself as a whole. Instead today, the Marxist left seems to have morphed into a kind of weird offshoot of Silicon Valley technophilia and a kind of like fetish for the future, or an image, a very deranged image of the future in which we're surrounded by artificial wombs and a kind of transhumanist escape from the body, a kind of robotic Gnosticism, which bears no relation whatsoever, I think, to this humanist and socialist and Marxist materialist feminist approach of the second wave, and not to mention the radical feminist approach. And I'm very worried that the left, of which I am a part, has given up on this historical materialist approach. It kind of abolishes, it kind of eradicates an entire history and understanding that has an anthropological dimension, a historical dimension, and economic and social dimension. And because this therefore kind of totally misunderstands then the slow, or forgets the slow and painful social revolution that saw women's increasing emancipation on various levels. I mean, unfinished emancipation, we might say, in some ways. Women's recent mass entry into public life, into politics, into the arts and culture remains, for all of its successes, therefore deeply fraught today. Let us not forget that the first female MP to take her seat in the UK did so only just over 100 years ago. There's obviously a much more complicated philosophical and political discussion we could and should have as a society regarding terms such as progress, tradition, liberalism, and so on, that Mary's already alluded to. But I think just to sort of finish, what happened on the left in the past few years was, I think, very shocking to me and to many women. Our participation in political life seemed suddenly extremely conditional on us agreeing with various lefty men. And perhaps this shouldn't have been so surprising. Perhaps I'm very naive. But I think for me and perhaps many others, it was quite a jolting experience to realise that you were only politically welcome as a woman and able to speak insofar as you had the right line, whatever this was supposed to be. Any disagreement saw you expelled, ostracised, and punished. Not to mention being accused of being hateful, being suddenly a member of the far right, and many other things that couldn't be further from the truth. So I think today there's a real space and indeed a necessity for a kind of new old politics somehow that preserves the gains of female emancipation and women's participation in political and social life, but that also doesn't deny the reality of their history and the meaning of words. For a politics that permits women's disagreement, that allows for real and serious dialogue and discussion beyond the kind of fanatical mantras of today, that if you don't repeat, you're basically kind of punished in sort of horrific ways. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you, Nina. Just a reminder to everyone watching that you're most welcome to ask questions now in the Q&A function. We can return to them later, but don't feel like you have to wait until everyone has finished speaking. I'm going to turn next to Nimco Ali. Nimco is an author, strategist, and leading anti-FGM survivor, founder of anti-FGM campaigning organisations Daughters of Eve and the Five Foundation. In 2019, Nimco was awarded an OBE for her activism, and in that same year she published a book titled What We're Told Not to Talk About, But We're Going to Anyway. Nimco, over to you.
Right, thank you very much, Louise, and thank you very much, Nina, for that powerful speech that you just gave. I haven't necessarily penned anything down, but I'm just going to complain about my lived experience over the last 18 to 24 months as somebody that has started an organisation which specifically is there to support African women who are on the front line of ending FGM, and the pushback that I've actually got from liberal feminism and women who I grew up with and who I considered friends and who I considered allies, in terms of the ability to understand that violence against women and girls is gender-based and there is a sexual element to that. So I work specifically on trying to end female genital mutilation, something that I was a survivor of, and growing up, something where I saw the liberalism and the ability not to offend actually put me in a cuddle sack, where the fact that my experience and my suffering was always seen as the other. And at the moment we are doing that to African women who have been at the forefront of ending FGM. For almost 30 years, it was African women who have defined the concept of FGM, took it to the United Nations, fought for that. It's been African women who have been challenging their own governments and holding them to account. It's African women who have been defining it as a form of gender-based violence. But what I've seen over the last 24 months as being at the forefront of actually leading a campaign and leading an organisation that stands in solidarity with these women is how they are dismissed as second-class citizens by those of us who are intellectually, I call it intellectual masturbation over what women's experiences are. We sit around board tables and talk about what we should be offended about, what we should care about. I have solemn seen an INGO that actually takes the lived experience of women and understands gender-based violence to the point where the fact that the experiences that we're having in this country, whether it's about our access to contraception, our access to equal pay, all these things are specific to our gender. We do not give that respect to women in Africa. We do not allow women in Africa to actually have the experiences of being women and defining those things that they've gone through. And for me, one of the key things that really stood out for me, and it's one of the things that Nina was saying, I have been somebody who has been kicked out of the left for actually saying that African women can actually define their own experiences, and it is not for us as white men or white women or liberal people that have gone so as to define what Africanism is and what the experience of African women is. You can't learn that in a textbook. It's something that is lived. So in saying that, I've been on the sidelines for the last 2.5 years, and I've been seen as a right winger and a radical for actually saying that women should be able to vocalize their own experiences and their own things. And within that, I think this came from the stem of this conversation of anybody that descended from the narrative of what the left or these liberals were saying was to be called a white feminist. I have sat, like, you know, last International Women's Day, I was in a room where so-called African thinkers were talking about white feminism being the major issue to women. And I was just thinking, like, literally the biggest issue to African women is African men. Solemn have actually, any of you women who will be probably defined as TERFs or white feminists, all these other kind of things, Solemn, are you the ones that are persecuting or oppressing the women that I work with on a day-to-day basis? That was followed by one of the largest INGOs who specifically work with women and girls, saying that they don't actually recognize sex-based gender, they don't sex-based biology. On something like FGM, we as women, 200 million women, cannot opt out by not identifying as girls. So for me, I'm in a situation where we're dealing with realities, where we're dealing with human rights violations, and that is being compounded by the ability of people to seem radical by using language which actually excludes the horrors of what's happening to young girls and women. And that is what I want to talk about. And I want to talk about the reality of the fact that we are in a situation where the infighting between the intellectuals on this side of the world is actually creating space for religious extremism in order to roll back the rights of women. We have sisters on our doorstep in Poland who have just actually lost access to basic human rights, which is access to contraception, access to abortion. We have had, since COVID has hit, because INGOs are too busy trying to define what a woman is, we have had more women than ever subjected to FGM. Early forced marriage has gone up. We are in a situation where we have an international institution or arms in our government which talks about girls' education, but solemnly does not define what girl actually means, and actually looking at safety and security and that understanding that education is a human right, but for girls it's completely different. We need complete different access to, in order to be able to attain access to education. So it's sanitation, safety and security. None of those things are ever talked about because we look at it as a gender neutral place. It's the fact that if we provide books, then everybody's going to learn. There are specific choices that people make when girls are born into their families, and those specific choices are basically because of the way that our bodies are set up and because we are the ones that produce and we are the ones that bleed. So this idea that we're being reduced to menstruators, and I can't say, like, you know, the FGM is about women and is about girls, it's problematic. But as painful as it is for some of us on this side of the world, in Africa and in the developing countries, it's actually killing women and girls. So I think for me, it's like we need to be able to take a grip of the conversation and really understand that our privileges, in order to sit around and talk about words and talk about terminology, is actually really killing young women and girls. And I'm one that said that I support trans rights, but I'm not here to circumstance the experience of women in order to be able to speak in a certain way. So yeah, so I'm just speaking from a position of frustration and a position of actually true heartache of after seeing almost I think 20,000 girls being subjected to FGM because of COVID, and none of us talking about it because the idea of actually talking about girls is quite offensive to people. And that is the situation that we're in. We're offended by talking about girlhood. We're offended, or I'm being offensive by talking about girlhood. I'm being offensive by saying that we need to be able to give women in Africa who are Black the money to do so, and to really deconstruct the way that we look at the aid industry, which is very much colonial. So I read a statement yesterday saying that many of the woke would stand with the historical suffering of women, but fail to see the realities of the suffering of women today. And that is how I feel as an African woman, is that I hear a lot about slavery, but I don't actually hear about the modern day slavery and things that are happening to women that look like me.
Okay. I'm going to go straight to Kathleen before we get on to questions. Kathleen is a professor of philosophy at the University of Sussex. Her recent research focuses on the nature and impacts of sexual objectification, on sexual orientation, and on sex and gender. And her book, Material Girls, Why Reality Matters for Feminism, will be published in May 2021.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Louise, for inviting me, and thank you, Nimco. I that was incredibly powerful, and I hope that some of the themes of what I'm about to say resonate with that. So I want to talk about academic feminism and some of its relations to liberalism. So academic feminism, as it's practiced by many in the UK and the US at the moment, is neither feminist and nor is it particularly academic. It isn't feminism because much of it is no longer directly concerned with women and girls. Over 30 years, like a slowly expiring frog in boiling water, much of academic feminism has gradually moved through 3 stages. The first says that all or nearly all differences between men and women are socioculturally constructed. The second says that all this social construction of difference covertly establishes heteronormative, racist, ableist norms about who gets to count as a real woman and who doesn't. And the third stage says that for academics to focus on women as their direct research would be to reinscribe these oppressive norms and so fail in some kind of moral sense. So on this view, woman is no longer a descriptive concept helping us communicate about a natural category of people, but it's a concept not so much value laden as value sodden, whose undifferentiated application has consequences for who is on the inside and who is on the outside. It's concluded that no one should talk directly about the general category of women and girls as such. And indeed, in some branches, perhaps to make it psychologically easier, academics have managed to convince themselves by various sophistical means that there was never any such thing as women and girls in the first place. Social constructivism is not popular everywhere. In the branch of academic feminism I'm most acquainted with, which is analytic philosophy, it's not especially popular, but something equally anti-feminist and anti-intellectual is going on there too, namely the frequently stated desire of philosophers to, in quotes, respect the identities of trans and non-binary people. And this translated means not just that you should be respectful in discussion with trans people, as you obviously should, but that generally you should transform your entire vocabulary in nearly all contexts, including academic ones, so that you don't make an inadvertently distressing reference to biological sex. Again, this policing of language is presented as having some high moral purpose. Meanwhile, across the board, we find the specious treating of the absence of a particular disadvantage in a person or group as the presence of a positive privilege, where that privilege is deemed somehow to undercut any further single claim the person or group might have to political attention. It's as if lacking disadvantage in one area cancels out having a disadvantage in another. This childishly simplistic calculus pays no attention to the magnitude of a particular disadvantage in a particular woman's case. The precarious situation of a particular woman on the streets isn't offset by the fact she's white, and nor is the racial harassment of a particular woman offset by the fact she's straight. The ultimate extension of this approach, when combined with social constructivism, is the claim that any woman, no matter whether poor, black, gay, disabled, has cis privilege because she's not a trans woman, that is, she's not a male. And meanwhile, of course, as we all know, in these tallies of privilege, class is the obvious absentee. Collectively, through these questionable moves, what academic feminists have done is very nearly talk feminism, understood in its original sense, out of existence in universities. Things that women experience in virtue of being one half of a sexually dimorphic species can no longer be easily discussed. And yet it's here where the most pressing social issues lie for women. For instance, in the economic vulnerability that maternity tends to bring, or in women's increased susceptibility to violent assault, or in the effects of widespread objectification on young girls' psychological development, or in the horrifying afterlife of FGM. You can't talk about any of these things properly if you can't talk about women and girls as such, and nor can you effectively talk about those areas of life where women's bodies, in particular, are the ones most often instrumentally used for the desires of others: prostitution, pornography, and surrogacy. This background also partly explains why academic feminism is no longer academic. As academics have started to think of themselves as social architects, actively working in the name of justice rather than simply documenting or explaining things, they've started to believe that it's immoral for others to disagree with them. People like me are not just thought of as intellectual antagonists, but reactionary moral enemies, inevitably driven by a desire to prop up a heteronormative, racist, ableist status quo. In this worldview, doubters or dissenters should be silenced in the name of justice, and it doesn't matter if that happens by rational argumentation or by ostracism and shaming. A frosty chill has descended, ideas have become dogma, texts have become sacred, and favoured intellectuals have become priests, some of them actually attempting to practice transubstantiation in the classroom. Younger entrants to this world need to first participate in the prescribed holy rites and prostrate themselves accordingly. Where is liberalism in all this? I think even if on a conscious level, liberalism and liberal feminism are now widely rejected by many academic feminists, still there are traces everywhere. For one thing, the hollowing out of the liberal dream of objective universal values has not stopped academics who say everything is socially constructed promoting their own moral convictions very fiercely with a missionary style zeal, almost as if they thought there were some objective values after all. Many of these moral convictions concern the prioritisation of freedom, autonomy and rights, without explaining why these get to persist as general values once their contingent constructed nature has been acknowledged. As I'm far from the first person to notice, in its enthusiasm for the forging of new social identities divorced from material conditions, modern feminism betrays a kind of liberal individualism on crack. When combined with the idea of a meritocracy, this can produce bizarre permutations, as when women athletes are told that to perform competitively against trans women, they should just try harder. Meanwhile, as professional academics working in neoliberal universities, academic feminists are highly likely to be, in David Goodhart's words, anywheres rather than somewheres, individualist in preferences and behaviour, and relatively withdrawn from common life, and particularly from the lives of working class women. No matter what their ostensible rationale, it's obvious that in practice the goals of academic feminism have often skewed towards the preoccupations of the cosmopolitan middle classes, whether it's a focus on white-collar work and the glass ceiling, or implicit bias within universities, or just focusing on alleviating their own thoroughly middle-class guilt about felt differences by emoting furiously on behalf of dramatically projected imaginary others. Equally, no matter how sceptical they profess to be of the Enlightenment view of reason, academic feminists are still likely to think of themselves as uniquely well placed to see what ordinary women cannot, via their superior rational capacities and quasi-technical methodologies. A residual paternalism, or maternalism, is still obvious in the policing of the speech codes of non-university educated women and in the frequent resort to impenetrable speech codes themselves without bothering to try and make themselves understood. Matters, of course, are not helped by the fact that the direct aim of most academics, fair enough, is to get enough publications to get a job and to be promoted. And to do this, there's no point kicking against the prick, so to speak, in your discipline. Your career usually depends on following your particular disciplinary herd in its guiding presuppositions. Hence, I assume, the keen interest that hundreds of basically straight, highly professionalised, well-organised academics now have in trying to queer various things via their publications and grant applications. The good news, however, is that our post-liberal feminism doesn't need academic feminism, or only needs it in a limited way, which I will try to explain. So in my remaining time, I want to sketch out what I think a post-liberal feminism could look like. It's where I get wildly speculative. First, I think feminism should acknowledge that the interests of women and men are not the same. Men and women are two different kinds of people with some shared needs and interests, but also many competing ones. And I assume that in any culture, it's likely to be that way. And that's not a point about nature over nurture, because even if it's mostly nurture, I think the point's still true. Sexual dimorphism, plus for the majority, a sexual interest in the opposite sex, produces distinctive masculine and feminine patterns of behaviour and social meanings. Of course, those behaviours and meanings are inflected by whatever other material and cultural influences are also present, religious, economic, geographic, or whatever. So we should drop any lingering hopes of a future utopia where all conflicts between men and women are either eliminated or rationally accommodated. Women collectively are the best judges of what is good for women. We can't leave political decisions about us up to men, including, by the way, the male architects of glowing post-liberal futures. Feminism should also never underestimate the significance of the fact that men are on average bigger, stronger, and more aggressive than women, and have a sexual interest in them. For this explains so much about men and women's social relationships with each other and the huge suffering of many women as a result, and it's academic feminism's biggest crime that it has tried to take away the words of women to say this. Second, I think feminism's aim should be the well-being of women and girls, well-being in an expanded sense, which doesn't just cover physical health, but also mental and perhaps spiritual health as well. The goal of feminism should not be equality, understood as getting or being the same as men, because neither of those things look particularly conducive to women's well-being. If freedom is a good, it's only a good because without it, women can't achieve well-being. It's not a good in itself. Nor, I think, should feminism aim for gender abolition, which again I think of as a kind of basically liberal fantasy. the complete abolition of masculinity and femininity, stripping us back to our supposedly rational cause. Yet masculinity is the set of the cultures of men, and femininity the set of cultures of women. And apart from it being impossible to abolish these cultures in any case, there are many valuable aspects of both. What feminists can aim for is the elimination of harmful gendered ideas and practices within various versions of femininity and masculinity that negatively affect the well-being of particular groups of women. But in many cases, even those changes will have to be gradual, because the practices sometimes have valuable sides too. At least they provide a sense of meaning and identity for the people in them, which makes them, those people within them, attach them and reluctant to change them. Third, I think local grassroots feminism is the best place to identify what enhances women's well-being and what detracts. Put crudely, the aim for feminism should be to acquire a kind of practical wisdom or skill rather than elaborate quasi-technical knowledge, knowing how rather than knowing that. I assume that what well-being actually looks like for a particular group of women may differ in detail from place to place and culture to culture, depending on the complex social relationships women negotiate there and how they interact with each other. But we should acknowledge that if left to it, without overt interference, collectively groups of women and girls can work out what is conducive to their well-being, or at least what clearly isn't. The problem with this in practice is that in a society in which many spheres of value are still dominated by men, and others by liberal elites, and nearly all by capitalism, what counts as women's well-being can get extremely confused, even for women themselves. And I don't underestimate the difficulties of working this out. Still, most women can, at least, easily identify the things that are obviously bad for them. For instance, they don't need academics to tell them that things like self-starvation, choking during sex, rape, sex trafficking, FGM, domestic violence, and drug addiction are harmful to women in pretty much any culture. Fourth and finally, for it to be effective, academic feminists should have a limited practical role in this work, as should any elite, and the same obviously goes for any financial elite, religious elite, left-wing elite, right-wing elite, or whatever. The role of academics is most helpful in feminism when thoroughly rooted in the evidential, when engaging in data collection of use to grassroots feminists, analysing women's local situations, or helping grassroots groups achieve their aims in law. What is unhelpful and should be avoided like the plague is those academic feminists who think of themselves as having privileged access to some complex ontological or moral reality that ordinary women cannot grasp. Thanks.
Sorry, I muted myself. Thank you, Kathleen. It was very fortuitous that we ended up ending on that sort of forward-looking note, because I suspect that's what a lot of the questions are going to be focused on as well. What do we do now, faced with the impasse that we're at? It seemed that the key theme in all of the talks today, and it was so thrilling to hear everyone, speaking all in one place, was bodies, what they can do, the way that they limit us, what can be done to us by our bodies, and the ways in which that has been neglected by an elitist kind of feminism. And I guess that's the key theme as well, is thinking of how do we engage with women's issues in an anti-elitist way. I'm going to go back to Mary and go through again with some questions from me, and then I'm going to turn to the audience. We've got some really interesting questions already lined up, and people ready to jump in and give their questions. Mary, one of the things that I thought about while listening to your talk was the fact of falling fertility rates, and that we've had since the 60s a very steady decline in fertility, and the proportion of women who now never have children has risen and is likely to continue rising. We're now at maybe a quarter of UK women who will never have children, and this is not just true in the UK, it's true across the Western world and also across much of East Asia. It seems to be associated with affluence. And I wanted to ask you why you think this is, whether this has anything to do with the way in which motherhood is marginalised, and also what the consequences might be, do you think, if we arrive in a world where even a larger portion of people, even the majority of people, are no longer having children, even aside from the demographic question of what that might do in terms of economic impacts and so on. What do you think that does to a culture, and what do you think that does to feminism?
obviously this is an enormously complicated subject, and there are people who spend their whole careers researching it, so I'm not going to try and summarize existing thought on it, except to note that it's now the norm, as I mentioned before, across most of the West, that on average women have fewer children. I forget the exact number, but on average women have fewer children than they'd want. So I think one sort of emotional, unacknowledged part of this is a generalized condition of mourning. You know, women who feel that children are missing from their families, who might otherwise be part of those families. And that's, you know, there's a sort of dramatic convention that we're not supposed to talk about the children we don't have. But I've only got one child. I'm 41 now. I'm unlikely to have another one. That's something I'm acutely ambivalent about. I've lost pregnancies. I lost one pregnancy. That's something which we don't generally talk about. You know, there's a sense of the loss or the absence of children is something which I think there are millions of women feel in their bodies and don't really have a language for. So that's really just to speak to that. In terms of more direct short-term political consequences, I can see it having a horrendous effect on the welfare state. The welfare state is effectively, it's predicated on economic growth. Economic growth is predicated, broadly speaking, on population growth. If the native population is not growing but shrinking, the only way to continue growing the population is mass immigration. And while I don't, you know, I am not a racist, I'm not a xenophobe, but it's fairly obvious that there's a link between mass immigration and rising xenophobia. That is, if you have the government faces a wicked problem where, in order to keep the welfare state ticking over, they have to continue growing the economy, which in turn drives the kind of xenophobia which makes welfare state politics increasingly bitter, increasingly contested, increasingly complicated. If the fertility rate continues to decline, I can see that problem only getting worse. I can see, in effect, the more we don't have babies, the more racist the place will get. I don't like that future. Another potential political consequence I can see falling fertility having is eventually, I mean, this is, I'm in properly dystopian territory here, but I can see it having an impact on the capacity of women to pursue careers and even to pursue education. There's a very straightforward statistical link between women's educational level and their fertility. As in, the more qualifications you have, the fewer children you're likely to have. You know, the women who are both professors and have 7 children are vanishingly rare. And so, you know, if we find ourselves in a situation where fertility becomes much more politicized than it is, which is plausible to me in the next 2 or 3 generations, I can see a rising set of, I can see growing political calls for women's access to education to be restricted. That's not a future I particularly like either. I can see falling fertility becoming connected to the increasingly bitter and polarized dynamic of incel politics, you know, particularly in a situation where monogamous marriage is on the wane and sort of polygyny. So this is a very good, I'll back off from that one. But in short, I can see fertility becoming a political time bomb for women, you know, well, this is an incredibly difficult area because women's, you know, it sounds as though what I'm saying is that we need to send women back to the kitchen, that we need to send women back to having as many babies as possible. You know, I'm worried that if we don't make motherhood more easy, if we continue to leave motherhood as this sort of unspeakable problem to be solved, then not only are we going to find ourselves in the realm of some really ugly political side effects, but we're going to end up with a generation of deeply unhappy women as well. So that's kind of the media. There's a very long answer to your question. That's the shortish one.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we'll probably have more discussion of this ongoing as well. The question I have for Nina and Nimco is actually sort of the same question. And I thought it was so interesting listening to you both speak that Nina, you describe yourself as being on the left and have historically been associated with the Labour Party. Nimco, you are more associated with the Conservative Party, have worked closely with members of the Conservative Party. And it sounds from listening to both of you that actually there was so much shared agreement, right, in thinking about the importance of thinking about bodies, about materialism, you know. And I was thinking about the way I was wondering how you both feel about party politics in the UK in terms of achieving feminist ends, because I think there's a shared sense of disillusionment with the left, but also I'm wondering whether or not feminism can work with the right in a useful way. Now, whether it's even useful about thinking of those terms, and actually whether we need to break away entirely from the historical association between feminism and the left, including the Labour Party, and actually be thinking, do we just, do we break away entirely from that, and do we just find our allies where we can get them, basically, and not really think in terms of left and right and Conservative and Labour. If I could start with Nina and then get the answer to the same question from Nimco, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good question. I think in many ways, a lot of what we're discussing is beyond left and right. We're talking about material reality. Okay, we can have these different approaches, we can have different emphasis in our politics, but there is a shared world, right? We live in a shared world, and I think, having kind of been, I don't know, I feel like I stood still, actually. I think my politics were formed in the 90s, but I think the left has maybe gone somewhere else, right? In a certain way, I feel like faithful to a certain moment. But I think, how to put this, the right is not also what the left thinks it is. I mean, the left also portrays the right as this kind of, terrifying, monstrous, compassion-free, violent, sort of quasi-fascist entity, and it's having been very much involved in leftist activism for a long time. I mean, it's a very fearful beast. And then you actually speak to people who are conservative, and they're, much more reasonable than the people who are supposed to be on your side. So, I mean, I think it seems to me, basically, what's going on in this kind of political dispossession, right, of a lot of people, not just women, but a lot of women, that there's a kind of bit in the middle that's kind of no one is sort of addressing, that there's actually, in a positive way, a great deal of opportunity for something like a new old way of thinking about things, which respects history, the history of women in particular, has these complicated dialogues and discussions about freedom, liberalism, political participation, social life, art and culture, and that everyone should be open. I mean, the left used to be committed to free speech and freedom of expression, and that's the left I also remember. And again, parts of the left that now seem very dominant seem to be radically opposed to talking and to philosophy and to dialogue and to disagreement, which again I find really distressing. And I think we should all be prepared to talk to each other, to talk to anybody. I mean, if you think your ideas are so great, you should be able to explain them to someone else, and the better to convince them that your approach has merit. The idea that we simply say we can't talk to these people, or we should cancel and no platform this person, is smacks of a weakness in your own position. It's not a serious politics, and I think we all need to kind of turn away from that, whatever description we give our own sort of political allegiance and affiliation.
Thank you. Nimco, can I ask the same, and also ask, it was so powerful and interesting to hear you reflect on your own experiences of actually working in this activism field, and could you also respond to how you found practically actually working with people from different sections of the political spectrum?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. I also wanted to just touch on something that Mary said, and the question that we're talking about, how the drop in birth rates within white population is actually going to impact in terms of communities. If you look at the rollback of access to abortions and access to contraception for women, it's not necessarily about women of color. So if you go America and all these other kind of countries, it's really limiting access to abortions for white women. So America has actually become become more dystopian in the sense it's white women that can't access to contraception, not actually we're women of color. And then you've also seen what's happening in Poland and other kind of majority white countries, where if the population is going down for those natives, then they will reduce women's access to choice. So that's something that I'm very much conscious of. And it's really interesting, like Nina said, I don't necessarily, so I was a member of the Labour Party. I've always voted Labour, and what happened was that the Labour Party left me. I never left the Labour Party, so I'm still in the position of things can only get better. I grew up under the Blairite generation, and I believe in those liberal feminists, or those kind of conversations where everything was great. And I think we really do a disservice to this country when we think that we have a right within the Conservative Party. We have people that think differently on economics in a certain context, but we don't have the anti-Semitism, the xenophobia, and the racism that people want to project this conversation around the right. And I am a child of civil war, so tribalism is something that I've always been sensitive to in terms of political ideology. So I worked with everybody, and I ended up being one of the first 11 people around the table when the Women's Equality Party was founded. But then we again came to those problematic issues of actually not agreeing that things like prostitution, violence against women and girls. And really, for me, it's interesting that when if we are saying about the Labour Party and the left, that it's come, like the position that it's come to, when a Black Muslim woman with a lived experience of a form of violence that actually marks 200 million women is the enemy, then so where the hell are we when we're thinking that actually prostitution is actually work, and we're putting the words of pimps above those of women who have actually been trafficked? Where are we? So the Labour Party actually left me rather than me leaving the Labour Party, and that's been quite problematic. And I've worked with every single political party, but I think the main core for me is how they respect and think of women. Both the Green Party and the Lib Dems actually think of women as a commodity, so I can't work with them. The Labour Party is quite problematic in some of the way that it thinks of women. And within the Conservative Party, there are people that want to listen and have conversations. I'm not going to wholeheartedly say that I'm a political party member of this one or that one anymore, but it's ultimately how can we push things forward? And conversation is the key thing. And I believe in a free market of ideas, and I believe in what Nina said, is the fact that I can come to you and I can talk to you about the burqa, I can talk to you about FGM as being a form of domestic violence, but if you feel uncomfortable about talking about those things because you might be seen racist, then you might be the issue. So yeah, for me, I'm privileged and I have a platform and I've been well educated, and I grew up in a generation where political correctness wasn't actually boxing children and specifically girls into communities that actually didn't believe in their basic human rights. So I was freely educated. I had the ability to actually go to university. I had the ability to see a Muslim society or a women's society at those universities that actually didn't conflict each other. But in 2020, I think many of the young women that are from my community or from my ethnic background are actually losing the liberties that I had 10, 15 years ago. And I think those are the kind of things that are kind of scary when I become the enemy for saying that the burqa is actually a symbol of oppression and being called Islamophobic for that. I think that's problematic when I'm being called racist for questioning why white, able-bodied, well-educated men are complaining as though that they're the most oppressed people. I think we definitely have issues, and the people that are going to suffer are going to be women.
Thank you, Nimco. I think, again, we're going to be coming back to this in the questions, looking at them ticking in. Kathleen, I have a question for you, which might be a little bit provocative, forgive me. You mentioned when you were talking about the way forward in terms of what post-equal feminism might look like, you talked about gender abolition not being a reasonable goal for feminists. And I wanted to ask whether you felt as though the radical feminist commitment to socialization theory, the idea that we're all born blank slates and that gender is entirely imposed on us, whether or not that commitment might have inadvertently sort of paved the way for the sort of transactivism that radical feminists obviously find incredibly alarming. That once we've started to, it is a fairly radical idea, right? And it is not necessarily something that is intuitive to most people outside of feminism, the idea that everything is socialized. And Michael Biggs, who's an academic at Oxford that I'm sure you know, he's suggested that actually in a way that blank slatism might have paved the path for transgenderism and might therefore not be the most effective way of countering it. And I wanted to ask you how you see these things interlocking, and whether there's a way of reconciling the two.
Yeah, I mean, I think it might have paved the way. I mean, it's going to be a multifactorial story about how we got here, and there's lots of different strands. I mean, one strand you didn't mention there, coming from academic feminism in the 70s, was the thought that you got from people like Catherine McKinnon that in order to escape the spectre of biological determinism, the idea that we're kind of programmed. So I suppose this is connecting to blank slate stuff actually, but instead of, so in order to escape the idea that women are programmed to have babies and stay at home, we would just say that womanhood was not being female. And then so we just separate those two out conceptually, and hey presto, we've solved it. Well, of course we haven't solved it, you know, and I think I say in the book I'm writing, you know, that's like trying to get out of the fact that an asteroid is hitting the Earth by defining the Earth as something that cannot be hit by an asteroid. You know, I mean, either we are biologically determined or we're not, and wordplay is not going to change that. But so that was about discussions about who a woman was, but equally, you know, discussions about whether it's nature or nurture probably did, as a sort of matter of history, feed into the kind of distaste that many people have for, in conjunction with noticing that women were having a really horrible time. Those two strands probably did produce a kind of downplaying of nature, because the worry is always that if you say it's natural, then people are going to say it ought to be like that, as if you can derive an ought from an is, which obviously you can't, or I think you can't. So I do think, though, that even if you were a blank slater, and I'm kind of agnostic, but even if you are a blank slater, it doesn't follow that academics, you know, dicking around in articles that only 8 people are going to read can socially reinvent, you know, the situation for womanhood. That's not how social conditions work. That is not how social construction works. So it's particularly stupid inference from an assumption of blank slatism anyway.
Okay. Should we go to questions from the audience? I think the best thing to do is, if I'm going to, the people who've asked questions and we've accepted them to ask them live, they know who they are. I'm going to call on people, they'll join us to ask the question. And then I think if I nominate maybe 2 panelists to respond, because I think if we all respond to every single question, we won't get through very many. So if I ask the first question from Emma Barnes, and I think probably the 2 panelists who'd be most interested in responding to this will be Mary and Nimco. But if anyone else wants to feed in, do let me know. So I'm just waiting for Emma to join us.
Emma, your microphone is muted, so when you have the chance, you can unmute him.
I think I've unmuted it. I wanted to ask about the generation gap. So it seems that younger women and girls are very attracted to the idea that biology doesn't matter very much. And I wondered why the panelists thought this was, and if it will persist, or if it's likely to change. And also some of these, it often seems the young are adopting these quite authoritarian attitudes towards older feminists who do think biology still matters. And I'm wondering also why that is. I'm thinking particularly about students, really, I suppose, as well.
Mary, do you want to start by responding to that?
Sure. The short answer to the first part of your question, I think, is the internet. The short answer to the second part of your question is probably parenting. To elaborate on that a bit, I recently wrote something about the period from roughly 2005, 2006 to the Great Crash, where I changed my name to Sebastian for a bit because the internet told me to. At the time, I was spending a lot of time around, well, what is now the very well developed sort of trans scene in London, and hung out with a lot of people, most of whom have subsequently transitioned female to male. Now, this is not a story I'd told previously or sort of wanted to weigh in on, because one of the things that was really, really palpable to me then was that how acutely distressing it is to feel that your presentation doesn't match the social stereotypes associated with your physiology, which is the core condition of being trans. But one of the things that I wrote, I talked about on this subject, was how inseparable the whole emerging subculture of identification was from the internet. You know, at the time, internet message boards were a very new phenomenon. You know, they were very much a sort of nerd subculture. But you know, here was a group of people who shared an interest, you know, they were broadly a kind of subset of the London lesbian scene, who all interacted all week in this online, in this subculture where, you know, it had its in-jokes and it had its romances and it had its massive flame wars, and it had a whole mythology and a whole sort of fantasy life in which, you know, somebody who was in reality, you know, a dumpy woman with a buzz cut, you know, could sort of transform themselves in virtual reality into a sort of, you know, into a modern day Oscar Wilde. And that was just really nice. It felt liberating. It felt beautiful. It felt like we were doing something radical and doing something subversive and doing something very sort of liberating and countercultural. I mean, it still feels freeing like that. You know, like, don't get me wrong, I absolutely love the internet. I fell in love with it the moment I first encountered it, you know, as a not very comfortable in my own skin teenager in the late 1990s, back when everybody had dial-up. You know, I still find disappearing into the internet and finding my people absolutely beautiful. You know, it's something, you know, I'm an absolute internet junkie. However, you know, whereas I grew up in a, you know, I still did my undergraduate degree in actual libraries where we read books. You know, I'm probably the last generation, you know, borderline Gen X and millennial. I'm probably the last generation who remembers life before the internet in any meaningful sense. You know, the people who are 10 years younger than me have never really not had the internet. And I think for people, you know, not much younger than me, you know, this idea that you invent yourself in you invent yourself in a world where you're disembodied, and you invent yourself in a world where, you know, it's up to you to find your own people, and if you fall out with them, you can find another set of people. You know, it's just a defining metaphor for how life is, and it's, you know, it's a sort of, it's baked into how they see reality. Just because that's what life is like when you conduct a lot of it, especially your social life, through the internet. So, you know, it should come as no surprise that there's a growing number of young people who want to sort of download, you know, and I choose my words deliberately here, who want to download that idea into reality and say, well, you know, if I don't identify with what my body says about me in meat space, then I'm entitled to change it. You know, as if I'm uploading a new profile photo, but in real life, and everybody else has to go along with it because that's just how the world works, isn't it? And then they get really angry when actually that's not how things work in actual physical reality. And actually, you know, the parameters and the rules and the limitations are much more concrete, you know, literally. They're much more material and much more long lasting. You know, and because, you know, and somebody who's grown up with this idea that you can just upload a new profile photo at any point, you know, is going to find it much harder to get around the idea that you can't do that with your actual body. You know, and poor Kira Bell, who recently took her case to the Tavistock, having detransitioned, having already had a double mastectomy and taken cross-sex hormones, which will leave her with stubble for the rest of her life. You know, she can't just reverse all of that because bodies don't work like that. You know, my midsection is never going to be the same again after having a baby, and that's just something you live with. You don't get to rewind or just change your avatar in real life. So I think, you know, if young people want to sort of dissociate gender from the body, it's because that's just the world they've grown up in, you know, and it's not going to change anytime soon unless we switch off the internet. That would be my conclusion there, or have a radical rethink about what we're teaching young people about the relationship between bodies and selfhood and the internet, and I have no idea where you start with that. In terms of authoritarianism, I suppose you could extend that line of thought to, you know, to think about, well, you know, if you're used to internet moderators having an absolute rule, then why wouldn't you expect it to work like that in real life? But equally, I think children and young people today grow up in a much more constrained world than even I did, in the sense that, you know, I spent a lot of my childhood roaming around pretty much unsurveilled. Whereas, you know, there's absolutely, I mean, my daughter's 4, so it's not like I'd let her go to the park on her own. But it's not that many generations back that people did let a 4-year-old go to the park on their own. And it's absolutely unthinkable now. And that level of monitoring, that level of control, and that level of supervision extends to pretty much every area of childhood. And this is something that's been well remarked on. There's the Free Range Kids campaign and so on and so forth. But you know, again, I think children who've grown up in sort of in a cultural norm of something that would have felt, certainly to my parents' generation, like an insanely micromanaging level of helicopter parenting, you know, it's no wonder that they're just not that into democracy, because they're not used to it. You know, their own childhoods have been much more like a sort of Chinese surveillance state. So is it any wonder that they're busy kind of importing that into their adult life and turning our adult politics into something much more along those lines? So again, I don't see it changing in any sort of hurry, unless the next generation of young people to have kids, you know, takes a much more libertarian turn. And, you know, I don't really see any realistic prospect of that.
Right, Nimco, what's your response to this generation gap question?
I think the generation gap is always there. I think we always, our parents probably thought we were completely nuts as well. So in that in that kind of sense, I do think it's about time, and it's about growing up, and it's about actually having lived experience in order for you to for things to change. As somebody that at university, before I really found my feminist voice and really understood what feminism meant, is the fact that I was told. So I grew up in the lad culture era, where the fact that we thought strip clubs and pole dancing were empowering, and as a 16, 17-year-old on my way to college, I would have fought anybody that said that, you know, the idea of strip clubs being violence against women and girls and being somewhere where women are objectified was horrendous. But circa 10 years after that, I was helping to lead the Drop the Lad Max campaign and so on. So I think it's a fact that the internet is not the world. So the whole point is that we are a fraction of this planet's population. Like, you know, there are people around the world who are still thinking the way that everybody else thought, and sees gender-based gender-based sex and so on. And that's how, like, you know, the injustices are being committed on a day-to-day basis. So we have so we have to understand that Twitter and social media are not the world, and not everybody that posts things on that place are the ones that are leading the conversation. And many of those young people will have their lived experiences change the way that they think. So I'm not necessarily that worried, but what I am worried about is about us giving up space and us giving up the work that we've done in order to intake things which are not actually constructive to women's lives and women's rights.
Thank you, Nimco. So next question I'm going to call on is Shireen Benjamin. And I think that the panelists who will probably engage most with Shireen's question are Kathleen and Nina.
Shireen, if you can hear us, you need to unmute.
Just unmuted, and I think you saw my screensaver for a moment there, which kind of shows where I'm coming from. Thanks so much to all the panelists. This has been a really, really interesting webinar. So thank you so much for your contributions so far. I don't know if you saw it. I don't know how much people outside Scotland read the Scotsman, but last weekend, Susan Dalgetty, who writes The Scotsman, wrote an article about these fault lines in feminism. And she did talk quite a lot about the generation gap that Emma just asked about. And what she said, well, what she suggested was that to find a way forward for feminism, there should be some kind of mass gathering of feminists or mass conference of feminists, a bit like in the early days of the second wave, where often younger feminists who have this liberal view can join with mainly older feminists in the case of the UK. And I know in some countries it's not, the older younger thing doesn't pan out in the same way, but I think in the UK it often does, that all these feminists could get together and talk about the ways forward for feminism, the kinds of things that Kath was talking about, and also the kinds of real life problems that the other panelists have mentioned, and together begin to forge a way forward for feminism. And now bracketing out whether some of the really fierce liberal feminists would actually go for that, because if you're very into the "there is no debate" mantra, then there's no way you would talk to feminists who hold a different view. But if we bracket that out for a moment, a lot of the people that I talked to thought that wouldn't be a fruitful way forward in any case, because so much is ruled out by liberal feminism that really matters. But my instinct is always that talking is good, and exchange of ideas across people who think differently is always good. So I'm wondering what the panelists think about the suggestion that Susan made. If it could be made to happen, bracketing out the concerns that maybe it wouldn't, but if it could be made to happen, do you think that this would be a helpful way forward for feminism, or would it be some kind of academic distraction? I'm just interested what you think. Thanks.
Lean, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I had this fantasy for the summer of 2020 that there'd be like a third summer of love, like after 67, 68, 89, 90, in which people would sort of throw down the internet and engage in sort of, mass revelry and being together. And it's a kind of you know, sort of trippy, delusional idea in many ways. But the reason why I think it was so important is sort of for the reasons that you're mentioning about the feminist event, which is to say, to bring people together, to actually realise that there are a lot of shared concerns, even where people are coming from different places, even where people are different ages and experiences, and that actually, you know, there are things that unite us all, you know, as women or as human beings, that are strangely and surprisingly similar. You know, the older I get, the more I sort of understand that basically the range of human experience is very overlapping in many ways. And I suppose, yeah, it's right, I think, though, that Shireen was saying, though, that a lot of people don't want to speak, like they just wouldn't come to that kind of event. Like when people started attacking me, I publicly said, like, let's meet, let's have a conversation, I'll pay for your train tickets, whatever. And I did all these kind of projects. And of course, people don't want to talk to you, like even former friends, they just refuse to talk to you, they'll just slag you off online. So there is a kind of problem if one side is saying let's speak and the other side is saying, like, go away. So, but yeah, I mean, I think anything like this, I think it's important, you know, like from a class point of view, not to overemphasize, though, the generation gap, this idea of cohorts. I mean, we were all talking about cohorts and Gen X and millennials and so on, but, you know, there are kind of other forms of group belonging that are often imposed from the outside. I mean, you know, if you're a member of the working class, then that's your, you know, another identity, you know, and most people have to work for a living. It's like, you know, there are other things that unite us. And so I think, you know, we should also become cautious about this generational rhetoric, even though it's sort of baked in a bit to how we think about feminism as well. And I think a lot of the time when earlier waves of feminism is dismissed, they're not really read. You know, in fact, lots of the discussions that are there, you know, that people are saying, oh, feminism needs to talk about this and this. It's like, well, they did. There's a continuing, ongoing discussion. You know, that there's a kind of lot of historical ignorance, especially when people are saying, don't read the second wave, it's racist, it's transphobic, it's like, you know, it should be dismissed. You know, that's the point about history I was trying to say, like, we can't just cut off history and pretend it didn't, you know, unfold in a particular way. And, you know, there are brilliant texts in the second wave. I think it's an unfinished project. You know, and I think the discomfort that younger women feel, you know, I agree with Mary's point about the internet, this kind of dissociation and this detachment. That's why I wanted the third summer of love, I suppose, for people to be together outside in nature and to, you know, to remember that kind of reality and shared being. But yeah, I think, I mean, I like it. I would go.
Can I ask, Nina, in response to what you mentioned there about I've had exactly the same experience of being friends with people with whom I have an ideological difference on feminist issues, and having to keep my own views secret, or feeling I do, because of the risk of being rejected. Whereas I feel like that doesn't go so much in the opposite way. I think that there's more of a willingness from the sort of, whatever you want to call it, the sort of vaguely radical feminist side, to engage with the other side. And I wondered if you think that that's sort of baked into the ideology in some way, or if it's just that it's because the liberal feminists are winning, and like if we didn't speak to them, we'd have no one to speak to. Is it actually just a majority minority sort of dynamic? You see what I mean?
Sure. I mean, I think there is a lot of fear, and I wanted to make this point at some point, you know, that you know, that we shouldn't downplay the kind of social punishments that women are receiving for discussing some of these things. I mean, you know, all over the world, this is a very, very contentious decision. And, you know, when I started talking about the Labour Party and the treatment of some of its members, you know, I knew it would be controversial, and I knew that I would get kind of punished for it. But at that point, I was suffering such cognitive dissonance, and I couldn't kind of cope anymore with the kind of obvious huge contradictions and problems that if anyone for 30 seconds thinks seriously about what's going on encounters. And I think a lot of women had this experience, you know. Also, we're kind of socialized to be nice and kind and accepting. And then, you know, but for me, the freedom to think for myself in the first place was so important that I kind of had to do it. I just couldn't sort of live with myself anymore. And I think, I mean, this isn't exactly your question in a way, but I suppose it's this, how do we kind of collectively overcome the fear of punishment? And it's easier for some people than others, don't get me wrong. It's like, you know, I nuked my life, right, so that I would have nothing to lose, right? I left all my jobs so that people couldn't lose them for me, right? Which is a very radical thing to do. And I can only do that because I don't have any ties, deliberately, because I chose a certain kind of life, like a certain way, a certain kind of freedom, you know, liberal or otherwise, but it's a hard life, and I wouldn't recommend that other people do it necessarily, right? But it mattered to me that I could think freely at any cost, basically. I'm so sorry, that doesn't answer your question at all, really, but there you go.
That's okay. Kathleen, do you want to answer this question of dialogue?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always encouraged by talking to students. I think it's easy, especially on the internet for obvious reasons, to start building up a kind of exaggerated picture of the youth of today. But actually, in my experience, the youth of today is really very similar to the youth of 20 years ago, 30 years ago. They're still worried about the same things. I mean, I've been teaching feminist philosophy all term. They're still worried about exactly the same things. And they talk about experiences that I recognize from my adolescence, and nothing seems to have changed in that respect. I mean, they might have developed a new vocabulary, but when you actually press them, it all sounds pretty similar. I also think that they, you know, obviously they disagree with me on lots of things, but we don't fall out about it, you know, and they can tolerate disagreement, most of them. And that's just like the whole population, you know, most people can tolerate disagreement, a few people can't. It's just most of them are on Twitter. So I think, yeah, I like the idea of all getting together and talking. Anything that would get you out of the house and off the internet would be good. I do think, though, that just feeding into what you were just talking about, Nina, that we might have to all take a moment to remind ourselves not to take offense at disagreement. I mean, we've got to practice what we preach. So it's my understanding that sort of radical feminist events in the 80s used to be they used to fall apart with terrible animosity and fights and infighting and storming out and all the rest of it. And we can't afford to go there, I don't think. So we just have to recognize that people can disagree with you. As women, it's particularly hard to be disagreed with, I think, sometimes. I think we really find it hard, and I think we should I don't know, I want to go to schools and just train people to be able to cope with somebody saying something that's really at odds with their worldview, and show them that they can survive that. It's all right. You don't have to like wreak vengeance or storm out. So yeah, I think it's a good idea, and we should do it.
I've got another question that's quite sort of future orientated, and this is, I think, maybe an opportunity for Nimco and Kathleen to look forward a little bit more in thinking about how feminism needs to progress. So this is from Rowan Davies. I'll just wait for Rowan. Okay. Hi, Rowan, go ahead.
Hi, sorry, that was all very complex. I first wanted to say just thank you to everybody. I've never signed up for anything so fast as when I saw this advertised, and I think for a lot of the panelists it's taken real courage to talk the way that we've spoken over the last few years, and I just want to say I appreciate you. My question was, what can we do going forwards? I know how many women there are out there who, whatever their views, left, right, centrist in the old conception, fundamentally think that biology matters, and that not only politicians but NGOs, as Nimco was talking about, charities, brands, corporate brands, there has to be a way for us to convey that our position deserves at least to be considered, that we shouldn't be considered indecent. My question is, what can we do to form a movement around these things, whatever our individual political positions might be?
Nimco, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I just basically think that science doesn't lie. It's one of the things that I'm really kind of I was doing a panel, and I think I'm going to speak freely. I was chairing a panel about access to contraception in sub-Saharan Africa, and I was talking about young adolescent girls getting pregnant and how we can kind of save their lives. And somebody interrupted me and said, "We're being very cis normative in this kind of conversation. Can we talk about trans women?" And I just thought that is the kind of stuff that I don't have energy for. I support trans women. I can hear about the conversation about trans women, but when young girls are being raped and pregnant and getting pregnant and not getting access to contraception, all these things, it's like science matters. And in the UK as well, this idea of the fact that if you look at the pandemic in the sense that we're all equal and we're all the same, has actually had a massive massive impact on women's health. So access to gynecological health, access to breast screenings, all these things have just been kind of taken out of the way because we just thought it's a pandemic, it actually affects everybody the same. So for me, I'm using what privileges and powers I have in order to push for more women and gender specific focused health needs and health services to be provided. So basically we have things like, so cancer has a 2-week turnaround in order for anybody that presents with issues with cancer to be seen. Anybody with a gynecological issues could be up to 3 to 4 months, and we need to change those things. So for me, I'm just gonna stay true and say the fact that science is a lie, and the fact that our anatomies do make us completely different to others, and we do need specific services for that. And if anybody's offended by that, I just can't really help it. So I'm not necessarily in the trenches as you are in this way of basically having to deal with people that disagree with me on a day-to-day basis, because I can just mute those on social media. But I just think we have to unite, and we have to be consistent of the fact that if we start to alienate our sex-based rights, then it is actually just going to kill us. It's not like, there's no way that we can write away cervical cancer. There's no way that we can write about womb cancer, all these other 5 cancers that kill women, and those are the kind of things that we're risking, that if we stop looking at sex-based gender and issues like that. So yeah, so I'm just going to keep going. I just think we just have to use the science, and that's just basically it.
Did I say Mary or did I say Kathleen? Whichever of you would most like to. You're both putting your hands up, so I'll let you both go. Mary, do you want to go first?
just very briefly, speaking to movement building, this is the sort of thinking about, it's more Nina and Kathleen, well, pretty much everyone apart from me, who's sort of more directly politically aligned with the left. But something that came to me thinking about the actual practicalities of movement building is that to a certain degree that's already happening, in the sense that it's not that many years ago that Fair Play for Women was a secret Facebook group. And it's now, it's quite a well organized body. And one thing I would say is that, there's been a certain amount of grumbling here about how the left has let women down, but actually a lot of the real powerhouses behind, for example, Fair Play for Women, come from the left, and they have the organizing and the mobilizing and the rabble rousing experience that comes from the left. Some of them are former trade unionists, some of them are still trade unionists, and lots of them just they've got the chops. And so, and if there's one thing I'd say, it's that one of the things that I found tricky to navigate, when it comes to that particular campaign for women's sex-based rights, is that sometimes it can feel a little bit exclusionary certainly most of the bitter infighting within that movement are around, for example, whether it's allowable to have conservative women on your Sherry list, to put it very crudely. Are we allowed to talk to the right? And that is a vicious topic of debate even within the movement for women's sex-based rights. And if the one thing I'd say, it's that actually this argument about whether or not biology matters is bigger. It's bigger than the left. It's bigger than the right. It matters to all of us. It matters to women as a class. And if there's one issue where I feel like we could usefully put aside more granular political differences, it's this one.
Shall I go? Just Mary, I think also you were talking about Women's Place UK as well. They're trade unionists as well. I think just to take up what Nimco was saying as well, I think the more information at a concrete level, that unfortunately this does put a burden on women to get really in there and have lots of information that they can then bring up in relevant context. But I think the more information, concrete information about what's going on in women's lives that can be appealed to when you're trying to argue with somebody who's a gender identity ideologue, the better, because their position is like so abstract, so up there. They don't have empirical evidence for any of this. It's just it's like people are under a spell at the moment in the UK. They are literally under a spell that just makes them blind to all sorts of evidence, and you have to really go through the facts. Just keep bringing people back to the facts, the reality, because it is reality that we all move in and we all recognise on some level. They know it. I mean, this is a performance. It's not really even an intellectual position. It's a performance that most people are taking when they engage in gender identity ideology. So I think anything that can puncture that kind of spell by bringing it back to the facts is a way to proceed when you're actually in the thick of arguing with somebody or trying to explain to your boss or whatever it is you're trying to do.
I've got a question here which is linked to some of what we're talking about now. I'm going to address it initially to Nina, but if anyone else wants to chip in afterwards, feel free. It's from Dena Attar, who is not able to give it herself, so I'm going to read it out. Do any of the panelists see a role for bringing back or encouraging small-scale consciousness raising groups, again, like we had in the 1970s, rather than more academic meetings?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm like I say, very up for meetings of all kinds. I think people should hang out in the parks and have like philosophical discussions. I mean, if I could just walk around a garden talking to people for the rest of my life, that would be great. So yeah, I mean, I think those groups were obviously historically extremely important for, you know, bringing women together, certain women, you know, as part of a class, recognizing shared experiences that were supposed to be private in the domestic sphere, but you know, coming to understand that they're happening a lot, really, and to think about women's place, which, you know, Simone de Beauvoir makes this point that women are the most divided class. They very rarely get together as women. You know, they're kind of separated through heterosociality and heterosexuality constantly. You know, we live in a very mixed world. You know, I mean, I've been writing about female separatism and male separatism as well in some recent work I've been doing, and I think, to be honest, I'm very in favour of these sorts of periods and blocks of separation of the sexes, you know, for these purposes of discussion and thinking together. I think there's something very singular and very beautiful about being only with women when it happens. It's a, you know, rare experience for me. Most of my life is surrounded in it's a male world that I live in. Many women do, and you know, there's something almost indescribably magical about, you know, single sex discussions. And so yeah, I don't know if consciousness raising, it's such a lovely hippie-ish term as well. Maybe we could, yeah, we should bring it back. I think sort of more feminism and psychedelics in general, like that would be cool.
Yeah, Kathleen, please.
Just quickly, yeah, I think absolutely. I think it's key to my vision of, you know, feminism being about well-being. You can't really work out what your well-being is, you know, amongst the people around you and in your life, unless you can talk about it with other women. But I think feminists then have to take the output of those conversations seriously, and they might not come up with the answers that other feminists think they should come up with. You know, I think you can't say that you haven't done consciousness raising right if you haven't, you know, divorced yourself from all your harmful adaptive preferences and somehow come up with the right set of answers. So I really do believe in the process of consciousness raising, which is basically just a fancy name for like women sitting around and talking about what matters to them, you know. And I think women should be allowed to do that. Of course, as Nina's just said, women don't that often get to be exclusively with other women. And it's really valuable that they do. So yeah, I'm all for it.
Cool. This is kind of what this is, right? It's just we have many hundreds of people watching on. I wanted to ask, I'm sorry, I'm really sorry if I'm getting pronouncing your name wrongly. Na Jabba, if you'd like to ask the next question. And I think this would probably be of interest to Mary and to Nimco, but again, I don't want to be too prescriptive, so if anyone else wants to chip in, that's also fine. Now, when you're ready.
Hi. Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, sorry. Okay, my question was, we were talking about generational gaps in level of feminism, but I think for me, watching this debate play out, it's more about a class-based gap as opposed to a generational gap. because as someone who's Black and who's moved between spheres, and I've lived in Africa as well before living in the UK, what I notice is that a lot of the concerns seem to be, I hear working class women, I hear immigrant women expressing concerns about, you know, not understanding some of this technical language that's being used in dehumanizing them, such as individuals with a cervix. If you were to ask half the people I know from Ghana who just migrated to the UK what a cervix is, these women would not know what a cervix was. If you say a woman should come for a cervical screening, they will know. But if you tell a university person like me or Nimco or, you know, hey, individual with a cervix, they might understand that, and that's fine. But when I see these gaps, it seems to me it's more coming from a place of class than it is necessarily generational. And similarly for people who are in government and stuff like that as well, I also feel like their concerns aren't necessarily grounded in what I like to call the real concerns of people on the ground. So they're unlikely to ever find themselves in prison. They're unlikely to ever find themselves in a domestic shelter. So maybe they become so removed from real life that they don't really understand how these are very real material concerns for women on the ground who will find themselves perhaps unfortunately raped or whatever, and find themselves sharing a space with a male in positions that Maria Miller, Theresa May, Lynn Featherstone are ever going to find themselves in. And would you agree with that? Sorry, that was a long question.
Nimco, do you want to start?
Yeah, I think Maria Miller and Lynn Featherstone might be on the same page, but I don't think Theresa May is in that kind of like, you know, the dehumanization and the dismissal of women and stuff. But I completely agree with you, and that's why I say that a lot of these terminologies and the things that are happening on social media are not necessarily what's happening in the world around us, and that's why we have to stand our ground and make sure that science and sense actually leads the way, because the whole point is there are so many theories that people have which are just nonsensical is on a day-to-day basis. And like, you know, a lot of people might find me saying offensive, like might find that like, you know, offensive, but I think when the rights of women and the basic liberties of women are at risk, we have to be able to speak up. The idea is the fact that we don't talk about people with prostates, but we're happy to talk about people with cervix. So it's those are the things that really irritate me. It's like the whole point is that cervical cancer is already killing women because we're already shamed about our bodies, and then to kind of dismiss it and confuse it to the point where we don't understand when help is being offered is massively problematic. So yeah, I completely agree with you. It is about class, and it is about an elite set of groups, just like, you know, like I keep saying, like, you know, intellectually masturbating and just chatting things about things that don't actually matter to us on a day-to-day basis.
Mary, I can see you nodding.
Yeah, I completely agree with everything Nimco said. I would add that, I mean, Nimco mentioned the lived experience of African women on the subject of FGM being dismissed as, you know, and if anybody dares to try and speak about that, you know, they're accused of white feminism. I would say, agreeing with Na's point, that white feminism, which is in itself not an illegitimate idea, you know, because different people's experiences are, you know, culturally circumscribed and by the circumstances of economy and place and class and so on. But it's often used as a proxy for middle class feminism, you know, by a movement which is allergic to talking about social class and economy. And actually, paradoxically, this sort of bizarre idea that we should call women individuals with a cervix is itself an extraordinarily bourgeois place to be coming from, for all the reasons that Naz pointed out. You know, so somebody who's an immigrant to the country might not have a Scooby-Doo what a cervix is, but you know, if you say women need to go for a cervical screening, they'll know what you mean. So it's very strange to find white feminism being used by people who are themselves guilty of white feminism, you know, as a derogatory term to close down something which in a funny way would actually, you know, root round some of these sort of class-based prejudices that, you know, it's almost as though the issue of class gets people so tied up in knots that they end up accusing people of what they're guilty of themselves. I mean, also something else which I think about a lot, particularly in the context of women's work and, you know, framing career success as the be all and end all for women, is the extent to which it's a Ponzi scheme, which again is something which is rooted in class and it's rooted in racial discrimination, in the sense that, you know, if you sit right at the top of the socioeconomic pile, you can actually, as a woman, be entirely liberated. You can have it all. You can have 7 kids and you can have the career as an investment banker. But in order to do so, you know, you'll be relying on a whole army of paid staff who chances are be women, and a number of them will be, and they'll all be poorer than you, and chances are some of them will be immigrants as well. And so, in a sense, you know, women can be free in a lot of the in a lot of the very simplistic sort of sense that I call Hillary Clinton feminism. But you know, that obscures an entire infrastructure of class and racial exploitation, you know, which people are not normally talking, which is just pretty much unspeakable. So yeah, I mean, this is a very roundabout way now of saying I absolutely agree with you. I think a huge amount of what's being obscured, what's being buried by this discussion, by sort of derogatory terms such as white feminism, are actually issues of economic disparities between the global South and the developed world, and they're issues of class, and they're issues of money, and they're issues of the power differentials that come with those things. Those things are acutely uncomfortable discussions to have. Even opening it up here and naming those things as somebody who is herself a bourgeois white woman, you know, I feel like I'm on shaky ground here. So yeah, you know, it's a difficult space to tread on.
A question from Joe Bartosh, which is also on this subject of classes. So I might bring Kathleen and Nina in to discuss further, and then maybe, because I think this focus on class is really fascinating, and I really want to dig into it. So Jo has asked me to read it out. Her question is, how can we claim to be a mass movement when in reality most women wouldn't agree with us and aren't engaged with debates around sexual politics? Should we just embrace the idea that, like it or not, we are an elite? Kathleen or Nina, would either of you like to start?
I mean, I don't know what that we is, but there's obviously I'm a member of an elite. So in the sense that I'm an academic, I fully acknowledge that. And I mean, everything I said about anywheres versus somewheres in my talk also applies to me. But I just don't believe that people like me can't criticize my own kind. I think I have to. I think I'm ashamed. I think there's obviously lots of people that have an interest in this question, especially if you're going to make it about talking about our bodies in ways that matter to us, that transcend. Lots of women have an interest in that question that wouldn't call themselves feminists. It's an interest. Honestly, it's a question of interest to every woman at some stage in their life. And the only reason that people under the age of 18 haven't realised it yet is because they haven't had or haven't noticed they're having the bodily experiences that will eventually confirm to them that it absolutely bloody matters whether you've got an ovaries or a womb or whatever. So I think academic feminists should just get out of the conversation, and there should be more at the local level. Grassroots feminism is the way to go. I think our kind can only mess it up, and I see my job as just basically limiting by contradicting, you know, in the current situation, I have to come out and try and combat the stupid things that other academic feminists say. But in an ideal world, there'd just be people working in the social sciences on empirical stuff. Nothing changes about the basic situation of women. That needs constant rethinking and reformulating and, you know, new hot takes all the time. We just need to get into the local level, I think. So I don't know if that really answered. That's my attempt.
Yeah, I mean, I think actually most people do have a commitment to reality and to science. And if you say, you know, if you describe what's happening with the transing of children, or, you know, unfairnesses in women's sport or access to single-sex spaces, people very much understand the reality of those things. And I think actually the elite here lies in the kind of luxury beliefs of this, you know, particular very vociferous, punishing, punitive, neo-puritanical, sadistic, Gnostic cult. And that actually they're the kind of ideological elite. You know, paradoxically, I mean, you know, there's the point about class and economic wealth and positionality that we were talking about. But I think we have to, there's a kind of level of a cultural discourse which you know, it's increasingly detached from reality and from, you know, people's concerns, and it's sort of intoxicating. You know, people get very caught up in it, and, you know, especially it gives you an answer to the maybe the discomfort you might feel with yourself, or your own guilt. I mean, a lot of these people are feel guilty, you know, these young people, that they feel like they've come from privileged backgrounds, and that, you know, in order to, in a way, differentiate themselves from their guilt or deal with it, that they kind of take up the cause of an oppressed group, so to speak, you know, and that would then dignify their own feelings of guilt. You know, we're very psychoanalytic creatures, you know, we all have very deep and strange motivations for the things we do, right? But they are you know, able to be unpicked. So I think, you know, even if most women, for example, wouldn't say that they were feminists, you know, whatever, actually the slow process of actually talking to people and being in the world, the real world, not the internet, you know, that these things, you know, as Kathleen says, everybody understands that we have a sex body. Everyone has a sense of themselves as a body, you know, as a woman, as a man, you know, moving through the world in different ways. And you know, I think that, yeah, it's the punishing people who are the real elites.
Would anyone else like to come in on this? No? If not, I have a question that I think takes us a little bit more into thinking about some of the practical questions to do with feminist policy, which is from Joanna Pedder on the question of the sex trade. Hi, Joanna, go ahead.
Hi, I was just really interested. I did actually get to go to Copenhagen in September just for a holiday with my partner and daughter. And I was just reading, I think one time we sat down drinking coffee, and I was reading about the Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, and she's obviously she's a woman, but I was kind of interested in politics, and it said that she was a big proponent of criminalising the sale of sex. And it's interesting because I kind of see a lot of this on my social media feeds. I see kind of like a kind of liberal men kind of from the Labour Party, and kind of this kind of different political traditions that we've kind of covered. And it's quite often them who are kind of the proponents of saying, oh, well, we should unionise sex workers, sex trade. You know, it's far more empowering than, you know, the Nordic model. And so they kind of give this Nordic model a lot of criticism, but I think I was just interested in the dynamic and kind of what perhaps you thought, Pat, on whether it's right to kind of fetishize the kind of sale of sex as something, you know, as inherently emancipatory. I mean, I've got my own view on that. I think I'm kind of rather skeptical, but be interested to know what our panelists think of that. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Joanna. Just for anyone watching who doesn't know, the Nordic model is a legal model used in an increasing number of countries, which criminalises the buyers of sex, but not the sellers. Who would like to respond to this question? Nimco, go ahead.
I always find it really interesting that the left never believe in a free market until it comes to women's bodies. And then we're for sale, and it's like, you know, the highest bidder gets this. It is extremely problematic, the idea that men believe to be sex to be a right. It's a privilege. It's a conversation, like, you know, it's a choice that whether you want to have sex with somebody or not. And money takes away that agency in terms of actually coercing women into the sex industry. So I'm a massive supporter of the Nordic model and a change in the way that we actually talk about sex and sexuality in this country. I'm hoping that one of the key things that if I could look for a utopia in terms of the way that this country deals with women's rights, is that I would hope for a decriminalization of abortion and the Nordic model to be the norm. But we have to have a conversation about the fact that sex is not a right. And I see this problem within the international development sector, where basically very liberal lefty men from here who work in the aid industry go and then are basically raping women of color and assuming the fact that just because they're giving them a bit of money, that the fact that they're actually helping them out. So we really need to have a conversation about this idea that liberation comes from the sense of women being paid to be raped. And that is a conversation where a lot of the young women that I meet and a lot of the young men I meet actually really I despair, because they have been sold into this idea, the fact that prostitution is actually work and empowering. And then there's also this conversation around sex work. We cannot compare a woman waving on a camera, even if even some of that is trafficked and oppressive, to women being raped on a day-to-day basis. So even this genre of sex work has a level of privileges and hierarchy that is in that. So I completely believe in the Nordic model. I am fundamentally about talking about the way that we look at sex in the relationship that men and women have with each other, and really get into a position where in places like Norway, like, it's embarrassing now to say that, like, that you pay for sex. And I want us to be able to get to that point which we have with drink driving and smoking, is the idea that people to be embarrassed to think that actually paying for a prostitute is or actually forcing a woman into prostitution is actually okay.
Kathleen, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I mean, again, in agreement, but I think I would also say, to repeat a theme, in order to see the real effects of prostitution on the women's lives that do it, we need to properly look that in the face and stop projecting, fantasizing. The average liberal male arguing that women should have a right to do what they want with their own body have absolutely no idea about the situation on the ground for most prostitutes. And I remember I watched a BBC4 series of short documentaries about Holbeck, which is the managed zone in Leeds, prostitution zone in Leeds, and nobody could watch that and think that these women's lives were going well. I mean, they were all drug addicted, they were all absolutely miserable, they were faced with all sorts of crime and vulnerability, and they were anaesthetizing their feelings. Their main incentive, or nearly all of them, was to get drugs, and the prostitution was a side effect. Now, that needs to be looked squarely in the face, and in the right way. Those women need help. Now, they don't need paternalistic academic feminists coming in and telling them what to do, but they do need help. And the idea that comes from the left that somehow because you can find one woman who's making a decent living whilst pursuing her art school degree or whatever, and that somehow she represents the true nature of sex work, it's I haven't got words. It makes me so angry. So I think, again, it's just the left at the moment, all stuck behind their not all of them, but the ones on the internet stuck behind their keyboards, projecting their own febrile fever dreams about what's going on in the world, and rather than getting out there and actually looking.
Mary and Nina, would you like to comment on this, either of you? Yeah, Mary, go ahead.
Just a very quick point. Nimco, at one point you said sex is a conversation, and then you jumped off to another point, but I just wanted to pick up on that because I 100% agree with that. And I think, I just wanted to loop back to what I was talking about, the way the privileging of freedom above everything else makes it very, very difficult to talk about those aspects of human life and human society which are fundamentally relational, which are about the connections between people rather than us as individual atoms. And I think this world we found ourselves in, where people have no intellectual framework for arguing against this idea that sex work is work, is very much a logical consequence of that way of looking at the world. If you have no intellectual framework for thinking about the relationships between people, then it's very easy and very logical to think about sex as a contract. Whereas if you're thinking in terms of the connections and the relationships between people, it's impossible to avoid the reality that sex is in fact a conversation. It's a fundamentally relational act, it's a dialogue, and in that sense it's radically incompatible with the idea that it can be it's comfortably combined with a transaction for money. So I would say, it's in a sense, if you're talking about one of the sort of accidental side effects of ultraliberalism, to me it follows very naturally that we should find ourselves painting ourselves into a corner where it's increasingly impossible to distinguish sex work from sex.
Nina, do you want to respond to this one, or if not, I can move on to the next question? No.
Louise, we cannot hear you.
Sorry. Can I bring in Rennie and Jay for a question on intersectionality? And again, I'll leave this open to the panel.
Rennie will be joining us in a moment.
Cool. Okay. Hi, Rennie, go ahead.
Rennie, if you can hear us, you need to unmute yourself.
Sorry, hello, hiya. Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you, Rennie.
Yeah, hiya, sorry. I just wanted to get the panel's views on intersectionality and to see whether they think that's being used or abused in debates, because it's a term that's been used often. And I think that also links into many of the discussions that you're also having around the sex and gender question as well, and questions around race and stuff, which I think are quite important. But obviously, some people may think that it's being used and abused differently. So I just wanted to get your take on that.
All right, thanks, Rennie. Who wants to jump in on intersectionality? Nina, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, just briefly, I mean, I think the original idea, like Kimberly Crenshaw and others, you know, was really, we're talking about women's experience of the law and the different ways in which, you know, race and class and sex were all kind of playing, you know, together. And in that sense, it makes a lot of, you know, it had a purpose, it had a specific and very useful and interesting point. So I think, in a way, intersectionality as such is not a bad idea. In fact, it added to a discussion, particularly within the sort of legal context of the way in which women especially were being treated. And I think what's happened since then is a kind of like weird mutation of the idea in which, you know, there's a hierarchy of oppression, and, you know, the people at the top are kind of holy almost, you know, it's like a religious cult sort of thing, and that nothing bad can ever be said about anyone who belongs to these very oppressed groups, and there's no discussion to be had, and all those things we're talking about. So, and I think, you know, when class drops out of that conversation, it also becomes a massive problem. It's like, you know, if you're on the left, the actual left, you know, one's economic standing is, you know, the most important thing in a way. That's how the world works. It's like whether you have to sell your labor power in return for a wage in order to stay alive or not. You know, that's a you know, very real way of seeing the world, and class has all kinds of impacts on, you know, your health, your life chances, and everything else. And so I think what we have now maybe is a kind of in this kind of elite discourse, you know, as I've described it, is a kind of intersectionality without class. Often, you know, it's a kind of oppression, you know, idea of oppression that's kind of completely unmoored and is often very fantastical, and, you know, as Kathleen says, doesn't really bear any relation to the facts or reality, you know. So it's kind of this ballooning off into craziness, which wasn't the original idea of intersectionality at all, which was much more material and concrete because it was to do with the legal process, you know. So something has gone wrong there.
Kathleen, go ahead.
Yes, again, agree. But I do think it's interesting how I think Crenshaw's ideas are really valuable, but she is very clear to evidence. You know, she's talking about various legal decisions and legal processes in the States, and she shows how Black women are double counted in various ways, and how they're missed out in other ways, but both because they're Black and because they're women. So it's more than the sum of its parts. She does it all really forensically. But then she points out in one of her articles that this plays out, this observation about intersectionality as a kind of causal phenomenon plays out differently in the anti-racism movement and feminism movement, because in the anti-racism movement, she says, you know, nobody thinks that the fact that not all Black people share the same experiences is a reason to stop talking about Black people as a significant group that have interests of their own. Whereas in feminism, and women have done this to themselves, basically, they have taken the message that not all feminists have the same, or not all women have the same experiences, to be some kind of reason to stop talking about women. And that just doesn't follow. You know, it's some kind of playing out of psychoanalytic processes rather than anything else. You know, it's the guilt, it's the self-abnegation, it's the like putting other people first or whatever, and not being able to just say, look, women are allowed to have their own things. Like, yes, of course, not all women have the same experiences, and we should pay attention to those differences and the intersecting problems that they cause. It doesn't mean that women have gone out of existence. You know, it's just crazy. So, yeah.
Nimco Ali, do you want to come in on this one?
No, I think so. I think it's all been said.
Cool. So I've got a question from Leela Sherborne, which I think will probably be of interest to Mary initially. Leela, go ahead when you're ready. You're muted at the moment.
Hi, I think my question was, do any of the panelists think there's anything worthwhile that can be salvaged from liberal feminism? And I brought the example of, for instance, I've really come to loathe the word empowerment and just the sort of things it's used to justify. And I'm wondering if any of you think that those sort of terms and concepts that are sort of integral to liberal feminism can be like rehabilitated.
Mary, go ahead.
Well, I suppose the first thing we should say is it's not as though we can go back or even that we want to. You know, there are a lot of genies which nobody is about to put back in the bottle. I mean, that's why I was very clear to say in my opening remarks that, you know, when I talk about wanting to bring motherhood and the body and babies back into the conversation around women, you know, I'm absolutely not about arguing that we should all return to the Victorian cult of domesticity, because that just isn't going to happen, even if, you know, even if somebody said that was the way to solve all of this. I mean, it's not going to happen, you know, nor do I think it, nor does it make sense to, you know, but it's not as though we can turn the clock back on where we are. The emancipation of women is broadly a good thing. You know, I mean, I'm a massive net beneficiary of the emancipation of women. You know, I don't want to go back to not having the vote, you know, and it's crazy that we should even need to say all of this. But, you know, these are all gains from liberal feminism. There have been 300 years of liberal feminism. You know, thank you to my foremothers for all of these things. Yes, absolutely, there are things that we need to salvage from liberal feminism. I just think the idea that freedom über alles is where we need to be going next is wrong. I mean, there's plenty more I can say about that, but that's really the outline. Yeah, I mean, I could write a whole book about this. You know, the emergence of liberal feminism feminism is, in a sense, you know, the answer to a set of material conditions that emerged with modernity, in the sense that, you know, women in a sense became less free in industrial civilization than they had been in the Middle Ages. You know, women had a lot more autonomy in some ways in the Middle Ages because they all worked. You know, in a situation where economies are structured around productive households, you know, women are producers as much as men. You know, everybody, you know, they might be more skewed towards childcare, but they'll also be engaged in artisan work, some of which is, you know, economically productive outside the household. And there are plenty of parts of the world where that's still the case. You know, there are, and it's only really with the advent of modernity and work starts being something which happens in factories or outside the home that you end up with this very stark split between homemaking and economic activity, where in a sense women had less economic leverage than they did in a previous setup. And so, of course, then liberal feminism emerges as a way of campaigning really to claw back some of that power, you know, in a way which is completely sensible and sane and justified, because who would want to be completely on the back foot like that? And now, you know, fast forward a couple of hundred years and we find ourselves in a situation where actually the material and the cultural you know, underpinnings of all of this are changing very radically again. You know, we're no longer living in a world where the split between work and home is quite so dramatic. And I mean, that's accelerated radically with the arrival of COVID. I mean, you have more of a split along class lines between people who are forced to go out to work because they have in-person jobs and knowledge workers who are able to shelter at home and do remote work. And so for the latter class, or women in the latter class, actually, you know, it's possible to return to something much more like a productive household. You know, a sort of 21st century version of the medieval one, where women are economically active and also able to participate in domestic life in a way which is kind of the holy grail if you want to balance work and family. But then there's a whole other class of women for whom that just really isn't an option. And how you balance those political interests, I think, is a really challenging question for 21st century feminism. And all of that really happens within a framing that says that it's not a no but response to liberal feminism. It's a yes and that says, can we look again at the economic and historical conditions that produced this, and some of the context in which these ideas emerged, and rather than trying to fight yesterday's battles and pretend that actually the scenario we're in is still the 20th century, we need to just bite down on the fact that the long 20th century is well and truly over, and look at actually what women's interests are in the 21st century. And that I think is really where we are.
Nina, go ahead.
Yeah, about what to salvage from kind of liberalism. I mean, I would say the freedom to think and to speak for oneself. You know, you could say liberalism never really happened in a certain way. There's always restrictions, but as an idea, as a kind of principle, and a very strange thing I might want to say about this is that the freedom, this kind of freedom, is also the freedom to fail. It's the freedom to risk things. You know, and that de Beauvoir talks about this too, that actually, you know, for women to be kind of emancipated and to be existentially free, to have freedom, it's also the freedom, in fact, to kind of ruin their own lives. And I'm firmly committed to this as a principle. I know it sounds very odd, but if freedom means anything, it is also the freedom to fuck up. You know, and like, but this is really significant historically, I think, you know, that it's to take risk. And if you want to be fully emancipated, if you want to not rely on, you know, men or family, you know, if you want to be kind of untethered in a certain way, like that historically is very, you know, unusual. It's a kind of unprecedented thing. So it's almost like a hyper liberalism of failure. I'm kind of quite into defending this.
I'm conscious that I gave us 2.5 hours for the conference. We're now just over 2 hours. I'm conscious that our bodies are, you know, potentially limiting us in terms of hunger and thirst and tiredness. I'm tempted then to, I've got 2 questions which are on quite a similar theme and I think will be of interest to everyone. So I'm tempted to go to those questions, round off all remarks from the panelists, and go and have lunch, if that's okay for everyone. So one question is from Alexandria Sherman. So if we while we're waiting for Alexandria, I'm gonna read out a question from Sue Nelson, who isn't able to read it out herself. She asks, when liberal feminism and feminists, male and female, plus so-called liberal organisations, shut down the reasoned discussion of certain issues, including the science as recent criticism of Newsnight journalists showed, through trolling, no platforming, censorship, deliberate damaging reputations, or refusing to feature certain viewpoints. How do you get these views through? Is a new approach needed? Which brings us on to Alexandria. Whenever you're ready, Alexandria, you're muted at the moment.
Hi, can you hear me okay? Okay, so first I wanted to thank Nina for calling it a cult, because having recently come from the other side, I can say it is absolutely cultish in its behavior. But my question is about where we can go online to discuss issues that affect women. Increasingly online in spaces like Reddit, Twitter, Facebook, and so on, women's voices are being silenced, where men's voices, no matter how damaging to women they might be, are being allowed to run free. And I'm all for local grassroots activism, but I also think it's important to not discount the importance of online spaces. I'm seeing a lot of disparaging about the internet, but many women with accessibility, financial, or other issues are limited in their ability to access these real life spaces and need a way to be heard and need a way to be involved with the conversation. Not to mention that the organisation for these IRL discussions will need to happen online.
Right, Nina, do you want to start by answering that one?
Yeah, I do. It's a really good question, and it's completely correct about this overly dismissive attitude towards the internet. I mean, for all we know, we might, you know, some of us might be trapped inside for quite some time. Who knows? So I absolutely take this point, and I think. In terms of very specific things, just briefly, there was a terrible piece in The Atlantic recently which tried to say that TERFs or gender critical women were like organising secretly online, and they, you know, there's something kind of conspiratorial and paranoiac and about it. And but actually, if you go and look at these new sites, which are precisely set up as partly as a result of Reddit banning various very interesting pages, they kept all of the horrible porn pages. but they banned like gender critical feminist pages and things like that. So as a response to that, some women did set up a couple of new sites which have a similar sort of format. So like Over It is one of them, and I think Spinster is the other. I've only had a brief look at them, and but they look really good in the sense that they're women run, and women are speaking freely about their lives and experiences and thoughts. So it seems to me that and actually the Atlantic article probably did a kind of like perverse service to these, because people might have tapped in the words and looked at them and then actually read it and gone like, oh, hang on, there's actually like, this isn't a bunch of Nazi women hating people. It's actually a load of really interesting and thoughtful and careful discussion. So I think it does exist, but it's being pushed away from these major platforms, as we know. But so I think courage to those women who are setting up those sites, basically, and they are there.
Hey, let's go next. Go on, Kathleen.
Well, I mean, I think, again, I agree with Nina about that. And I think everything has a good side and a bad side. And we've concentrated here perhaps on the bad side of the internet, but clearly we're all on the internet right now and we couldn't be doing this. And I think also, particularly in the States, I'm told, where it's just really difficult to get feminists together physically, given the distances involved. The internet just is an amazing tool for that. But the first question was about media coverage, was it? About how we get our point of view across when it seems like so many publications are, on the left anyway, aren't willing to hear it. Yes, I mean, I don't really have anything very insightful to say about that because it's just true. I think, just very briefly to reiterate 2 points have already been made. One is, I think I'm increasingly convinced that we have to talk to everybody within reason, and everyone will draw their own lines, but we can't be pure about the venues that we write for or appear in, and I've not necessarily always taken that view in the past, so that's definitely a change, I think. And secondly, I think we just have to keep remembering that we're talking about the truth and reality, and even newspaper journalists and even Guardian readers move in that reality. So I just can't see how this can stand. I think this is a temporary aberration. There will be other aberrations. I'm not particularly optimistic. I think the human race can produce, weird aberrations at various points, but this is not going to last. The idea that you can change who you are from one day to the next by how you feel, and that should dictate how everyone else around you responds to you, it's just not sustainable. It's not reality compliant. So I think we just have to keep naming reality and hoping that eventually the BBC and the Guardian will be forced to recognise reality.
Yeah, Mary, go ahead.
Just very briefly, about a year ago, I wrote something on what I call policy laundering, which is to say organisations which are funded by government to lobby government to do things that the government already wants them to do, which has appeared as a kind of ecosystem to replace independent civil society campaigning groups. I mean, you can see it. You see it, for example, in the enormous volume of money that Stonewall receives from the government in exchange for educating, for example, the police force or schools on things which the government have sort of uncritically accepted are desirable things that ought to happen. And one of the things that's exercised me for some time, seeing this sort of bizarre kind of unreal conversation, is a sort of aspartame version of civil society engagement taking place, and just thinking, well, if you're not an insider to this, how do you even break in? And my sense is that there's something of that frustration behind these two questions. When it feels like it's just wall-to-wall astroturf on something that actually the majority of people don't believe, how do you even make cracks in that facade? And I suppose I wanted to sound a note of optimism, which is to say, You know, I've seen at least two substantial examples in recent years of grassroots campaigns which have made a dent in the policy laundering ecosystem. And one which might be offensive to some people in this conversation is the Brexit campaign, which took something like 25 years of grassroots agitation to get round, you know, a fairly rock solid elite consensus that in fact ever closer integration with the European Union was what the British public wanted, and just nobody was interested in hearing arguments to the contrary. And you know, obviously that's for better or worse, that's not where we are now, partly as a result of 15, 20, 25 years of grassroots campaigning. And actually the campaign of resistance, the massive grassroots crowdfunded campaign of women's resistance against the changes to the Gender Recognition Act is another example, you know, from a very different political group in terms of left and right, of, you know, the same pushback against the policy laundering ecosystem that really has very little regard for what grassroots civil society interests or priorities are. And so I wanted to sound a note of optimism to say we just have to keep pushing. You know, we have to keep mobilizing at the local level, but also on the internet. And actually, just to loop back to somebody else asked a question about elites and say, well, you know, shouldn't we just accept the fact that we're elite? And I think, well, actually, the majority of women, if you ask them whether female biology exists and matters, will say, well, yeah, of course it does. But it's just that the majority of women aren't going to get involved in campaigning about it because we're busy. You know, we're raising our children or going to work or, you know, doing all the other normal things that normal people do who aren't weird obsessives who think about politics all day like me. And so, you know, I think it's okay to be an elite, I think is what I'm trying to say. You know, it's okay to try and crystallize some of the concerns which actually are pretty endemic in society as a whole, and try and sort of, you know, try and form those into a slightly crisper shape such that they can shift the conversation in a more reality-based direction, Kathleen, as you put it. So yeah, I'm not massively optimistic, but I'm not completely hopeless either. We just have to keep pushing, and it's okay to be loud and vocal, and you know, try and crystallize movements around that. You know, there's a role for big and small in that.
Right, Nimco, how optimistic are you?
I'm quite optimistic. I think sense will prevail, and it is about, like, you know, building on the foundations that we have and just keep pushing forward. So I work on a specific issue which is specifically gender focused, and it's tarred humanity for 4,000 years. And I do think there's a tangible reality in ending FGM, and I do really think feminism has a role to play in that. But I think we have to stop being so self-absorbed that there are more women in the world and there are other issues that are happening at the moment. And this very internalization on ourselves and this infighting is actually what other people are benefiting from. And I've said that before. I think we need to look outside the box and actually see who the people that are giving us the things that we're fighting over are.
Great, thank you. And thank you so much to everyone. This has been fascinating. I've not been able to follow it very closely, but I can see that there's been really great response on social media, and loads of people have been watching, and this is going to be available to stream later as well if you missed any of it. And we'll be sharing links on Twitter and so on for anyone who wants to catch up. So yeah, thank you so much for our speakers. It's been an absolute delight, not only to hear you, but to hear you all in concert and responding to the audience. And thank you for some marvellous questions. And yeah, stay tuned for there will be further conferences in the Res Publica Post-Liberal series, maybe some more on feminism as well. See what the demand is. So yeah, have a lovely afternoon, everyone.